Hello and welcome to the Sustainability Experts. I'm your host, Vanessa Thompson, and in this episode, we're covering both the environmental and social pieces of sustainability with our incredible guest, Leah Thomas. Leah Thomas is the author of the book, The Intersectional Environmentalist. She's also a 30 Under 30 winner and an activist who's been featured on Vogue, CNN, The Washington Post, New York Times, and NBC. Her Instagram post, Environmentalists for Black Lives Matter, went viral in 2020, bringing awareness to the relationship between social justice and environmentalism. She also hosts events like London's first Black Ecofeminist Summit, which sold out, and her continuing series of events, which are her Earth Summits, bringing together music and environmental education. Leah, thank you so much for joining us today. I feel so honored to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. This is so cool.
Yeah, and I know I just introduced you, but I would love if you could talk a little bit more about yourself and the story of how you first became an intersectional environmentalist.
Absolutely. So I'm a Midwesterner, was born in St. Louis, and I made my way out to California, like many Midwesterners want to do. And I studied environmental science and policy. And throughout that process, I just always loved to write. So I was also blogging on the side and doing whatever I could. And then unfortunately, when I was in school, that's when there started to be a lot of conversation about racial justice and systemic inequality and all those sorts of things. And I really wanted to bring that work for social justice into my environmental science program. And at the time, which is changing at universities all around the country, it wasn't mandatory to learn about environmental justice or the intersections of like who is the most impacted by climate issues. So it's something that I kind of did outside of my program and then realized I don't want to do that. I don't want to have an environmental life and then a social justice life. Those things definitely do go hand in hand. So I set out to be an intersectional environmentalist, which is just a long way of saying someone who cares really deeply about both social justice and environmentalism and advocates for both and explores those intersections. And I've tried to do everything I can to, just make that as easy as possible for people to understand. So I wrote the book. I use Instagram because I want to meet people where they're at. I've also worked in corporate, sustainability communications at companies like Patagonia. And I just try to talk about it as much as I can.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story with us. I think it's something that a lot of the people who are listening to this can either really relate to or empathize with. So thank you for that. And I know in your book, you obviously break down what intersectional environmentalism is, but I'd love to break that down for our audience. I think a lot of people think of racial justice and sustainability as very, very separate issues, but in your book, you talk about a lot of examples where it's just impossible to break these two social issues apart. Could you talk a little bit more about breaking it down and also maybe some of the things from your book as well?
Absolutely. So when I was studying environmental science, I would always learn about, I guess, the what of environmental issues and hazards. So they would say, okay, we're learning about this particular waterway is polluted. And then I would always ask the question like, well, who
Who's
is being
affected?
impacted by that waterway? It was so strange to me because sometimes, we would always just talk about the what. So we would say, oh my gosh, there's so much carbon in the atmosphere. And then being like, well, who is going to be impacted by it or who's being impacted right now? So I started doing different studies, doing geographic information systems and making maps that infuse that who into the equation. So when I was looking at where toxic waste sites and facilities were placed in the United States, and also looking at things like race and median income, and then I was able to say, okay, the people who are most impacted are communities of color, lower income communities, and sometimes those things, overlap and intersect.
Yeah.
So that's what it means to be an intersectional environmentalist and kind of how I got to that point, just really trying to understand like who is experiencing the burden of a particular environmental injustice, because policies can't just be, in my opinion, blanket policies because different people are impacted differently. Some people are experiencing the effects of the climate crisis right now. Even if we're just looking at the communities in California, most vulnerable to, fires, or if we're looking at communities like New Orleans and everything that we saw with Hurricane Katrina, I think it's really important to have comprehensive policy that accounts for who is being burdened the most by environmental injustices. So that's what it means. And that's how I kind of got into it. I was really just looking at like, well, where are all of these hazards happening? They're not just hypothetical things that are happening in the world. And then being really frustrated by the same communities that are experiencing education inequality, lack of food access. They're
Yeah.
also experiencing lack of tree cover, polluted air, and all sorts of environmental injustices.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really beautiful way to break it down. And I know one of the examples that you talk about in your book is electric vehicles and clean tech and intersectional environmentalism in that context. But I think what you said is particularly poignant because there's so many sustainable technologies today that are just not inclusive. And just for our audience to hear, something you talk about in the book with electric vehicles is the mining of lithium, which goes into the batteries for electric vehicles. And I think a lot of people think that, electric vehicles are this end all be all solution for green transportation, and they don't understand that there's actually a very unethical supply chain to get there. Where 70% of lithium comes from South America, and it normally requires deforestation of the forests, environmental harm, and also encroaching on indigenous people's land. And this is just a really colonialist solution where you're taking resources from a South American country, harming that country environmentally and socially, and then taking that resource to benefit North American countries or European nations. So I would love to kind of just talk about the lens of intersectional environmentalism in terms of how we choose to invest in different clean tech technologies and sustainable technologies. So I'd love to learn more from you about how can we use this as a lens to really choose good investments that really think more holistically.
Yeah, I think when questions like this come up, it's so hard because, of course, I want us to, stop relying on oil. But it's frustrating because I'm so passionate about, electric vehicles and having a more renewable future and solar, etc. So I
Yeah,
don't want to discourage anyone from thinking that everything we choose, like no matter if it's an electric car, it's going to be
sure.
just as bad as like a gas car, because that's not the case. But
Mhm.
again, like I said earlier, we really need to be asking the question, okay, if we're extracting resources, even if that's like a lithium mine, understanding like who are the community stakeholders, who lives
Yeah,
around the lithium, is there water being polluted? How can we ensure that that's not happening? So I think
mhm.
really making sure we infuse social justice and just empathy into that green energy transition will really help us from having to do a lot of cleanup later. Because even if we're talking about the lithium triangle, like you mentioned, there are a lot of communities right now who are currently being impacted. So they're having water shortages. They're not really benefiting monetarily from the lithium that's powering our renewable future. So just
Mhm.
making sure, like, what sort of social programs can we help support to make sure that people in the community perhaps are being employed, or how can we make sure that they have an avenue to raise their concerns? Because
Yeah,
oftentimes if we see like like a wind farm or something like that, it's like, okay, check, we have a wind farm, moving on. But making sure we do that extra step of saying, is the community being impacted in any way, whether it's
Mhm.
positive, whether it's negative, and how we can make sure that we're supporting those sorts of programs and not stopping there. So just really asking those questions again. The main takeaway I want people to know is to always ask the question who
Mhm.
before you propose any sort of environmental solution. And if you don't know who the people are that are being impacted, then that's a stakeholder that you definitely need to invest in and get really acquainted with.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you see that changing right now? Do you see any kind of social programs that you are really proud of that actually are really getting local and talking to the people on the ground?
Absolutely. I feel like, which I love, there's that phrase, what is it? Think global, act local. It's
Yeah.
been in the sustainability space for quite some time. But I'm seeing, I think, especially in the areas of food justice, not necessarily
Mm.
renewable energy, crossing my fingers that that will happen. And I'm sure
Yeah.
there's someone listening who has like amazing case studies. Please share them
Yeah.
far and wide, to inspire confidence in us all. But I think in the food justice space, I've seen a lot of amazing community gardens. There's one called the Compton Community Garden, not too far
Okay.
from me. And just seeing people saying like, okay, yeah, we don't have enough fresh food or produce in this particular area, but how can we invest in this community garden or this
Mhm.
initiative that's already happening? And it's been amazing to see not only just locals supporting that, but also seeing other companies step in
Mm.
and redistributing wealth so those things can kind of thrive. And yeah, that's one of my favorite things. I always want people to get connected to local grassroots environmental justice organizations. And I recommend companies diversify who they're donating to. Don't just donate to the big
Mm.
environmental organizations. But I get so proud when I see companies donating to some of those smaller, more
Mm.
niche organizations that are really meeting a specific need in that community. So I'm seeing
Interesting.
that happen a lot more.
Nice. Yeah. Um, and I think, this is something you talk about also in your book, but breaking down kind of critical race theory as it's an additional kind of lens to this, with a lot of corporations talking about kind of racism and DEI and sustainability as these separate issues. I'd also like to talk about this kind of dynamic that you talk about in your book between race, power, and sustainability and how they cannot be separated. I know you mentioned, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw's work in your book, which I love her work. But how can we also define kind of critical race theory in the scope of sustainability, just to kind of add on to that?
That's a great question. I would say one thing, which isn't controversial, might sound like it, not really, but it's easier to be sustainable if you have wealth.
Mm.
So I think when I'm a lot more, I'm empathetic, but I'm a lot more um, okay, so yeah, if you have wealth, it's very easy to be sustainable if you'd like to, because you
Mm.
can get the electric car, you can buy the expensive Tupperware, you can buy
Mhm.
a $200 fair trade, ethically sourced, shirt and
Right.
wardrobe, etc. So I do want to kindly advocate for people who are in positions of power to
Mhm.
recognize that reality that
Yeah.
yes, we all need to do our part to make sure that we're saving the environment, but with the people with the resources to do so, at that point, there really is no excuse, in my opinion, because the barrier
Yeah.
to entry is a little less steep. But I
Yeah.
also want to recognize the reverse is also true. So I think sometimes people might have these like blanket solutions for everyone, like just get rid of
Mhm.
plastic, just get an
Right.
electric car, just do this thing.
Yeah.
We're talking about even in Southern California, our public transportation is awful, and there are systems that need to be changed to make sure everybody can have access to living a sustainable life, and a sustainable life that's not just about scarcity.
Yeah.
Because if I were to talk to everyone who was lower income or perhaps didn't have all the privileges that other people had and just said, well, just get with the program. Like you need to eat
Yeah.
kale, not having joy in life. Like you need
Yeah.
to sell all your belongings so you can have an electric car and at least you'll have that.
Yeah.
It's not really recognizing those power imbalances. I think it's really important to talk to people on a personal level and kind of see what they're working with and then
Yeah.
provide solutions to be sustainable based on things that really, work for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that reminds me, there's this one project in Berkeley called the Cool Climate Network, and they were the first carbon calculator like 20 years ago. And I remember them doing a lot of analysis on if you're low income, the main contributor to your carbon emissions is your meat consumption. And if you're
Mhm.
high income, the largest contributor is your travel and your
Mhm.
transportation. So there's even, we need to be thinking about what do we prioritize also depends on the region, the resources, the group of people, the languages. All of these things are huge, huge factors.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and that actually reminds me of one quote that you mentioned in your book when you're talking about critical race theory. It's the second element of when you're defining critical race theory. The first element, you talk about how these racist ideals of white supremacy, which create bias through all these institutions. And in the second piece, you have this quote, which is, we can transform the relationship between racism and power. And I thought
Mhm.
that was great to define it, but I also thought it was really empowering as well and very inspiring. So I'd like to break down this quote that we talk about, and talk a little bit more about this statement and how this transformation takes place. How can, we as individuals or as corporations, how can we transform this relationship between racism and power?
Yeah, again, another great question. Especially in our current climate where I am a little concerned about workplace culture and even universities. I
Mhm.
don't know if it was Ohio or Oklahoma, a state that starts with an O, but they had to ban DEI offices. And I think that's something that they're fighting, or DEI offices are now being defunded. And that's kind of a trend that we're seeing.
Wow.
It's kind of a backlash to 2020. We're seeing a lot of kind of DEI professionals like lose their job, or people kind of questioning the importance of them.
Yeah.
DEI is not just about race. And I think it's really important for people to look internally and just understand that we are complex individuals. So even like, did you grow up in a two-parent household? That's a different experience. What's your
Mhm.
religious background? What kind of town did you grow up in?
Yeah.
All of these sorts of things. And I think just, I don't know, coming to terms with your own identity and having empathy for other people's experiences, I do think makes a better workplace. But I guess to answer your question, I think it's really important in my work to always have hope for things. And I want people to know that it is possible to transform systems.
Mm.
And maybe that's a part of the reason why my book is so colorful and a lot of my work is really colorful, because I might be talking about like the worst environmental injustices in the world, but I
Yeah.
want to remind people that like, okay,
Mm.
we need to sip this tea for a little bit, but we're not going to get stuck here, and we can actually play an active role in transforming these systems. So I
Mm.
think the first step is just recognizing what the problems might be. Again, assessing who might be unfairly impacted by a particular thing, and then getting some steps. So whether that is bringing in a DEI consultant as one thing,
Yeah.
whether that's just constantly asking questions. There's a consulting project I'm working on right now in the tech space, which is completely new for me, but just even looking at the ways that like software engineers, like they have so many questions of like what could possibly go wrong. And it doesn't
Yeah.
mean they don't have faith in what they're doing, but because they have so much faith in what they're doing, they're looking at every possible scenario of what
Mm.
can go wrong, and how they can improve it. And I think that's something we can all kind of carry in our work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this leads, to a lot of the events that you host as well, too. I mean, you combine environmental education and music and all of these other things as solutions. Can you talk a little bit more about, those things?
Yeah, I mean, I call it the broccoli and the ice cream, which I think is really important. So, like, the broccoli is like the environmental education, and the ice cream is like the creativity and the
I
color
love it.
and the music and the community. Because again, I think in sustainability communications and DEI communications, it's really important to show people that it's not just about like the end of the world or everything that's wrong. And it's not just completely about
Yeah.
dismantling systems. Like there's beautiful things that come from DEI, like exploring other people's cultures. It's not just a conversation about like privilege and punishment. I don't
Yeah.
know how many DEI trainings I've been to where I honestly, like, I support them, the consultants. I want them to, make their money. But I'm just sitting there and I'm like, this is so depressing and it's so sad. And it's the same with climate. Sometimes
Mhm.
sustainability initiatives, they don't feel fun. It feels like a
Yeah.
burden. You feel like you're losing things and have to,
Yeah.
give things up. So really creating spaces where we can show people like you can be passionate about the planet, and you can
Mhm.
also find community. You can also broaden your horizons. You can also do all these other things. So that's
Yeah.
why I create those sorts of experiences, because I want people to associate sustainability and intersectional environmentalism with hope and radical
Yeah.
imagination and, better possibilities for the future and the present.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that brings more people to the movement as well because it encourages them to have a good time, to relax, to enjoy the music, but then also kind of be emotionally ready for all of that information as well. So I love that. Well, you often talk about kind of bringing together the movements of feminism, of social justice, and sustainability all together. And how, you kind of conclude your book with talking about how we all have to work together in all of these movements in order to win. And I kind of wanted to ask you about how do you envision this progress? How do you envision if everyone woke up tomorrow and said, I'm going to be an intersectional environmentalist, I'm going to dedicate myself to this? What would you see the path forward ideally looking like?
Ooh, well, I think yeah, there would be a lot more empathy, I think, for other
Yeah.
people's experiences. I
Hmm.
think something that's hard for climate people sometimes is to understand that there are like other movements with people who are just as passionate about another topic. Like
Yeah.
people, even like a nutritionist, like there's someone who knows a lot about B12
Hmm.
or like knows a
Yeah.
lot about kale and all of its applications. And it's like hard for me as an environmentalist to wake up to the reality, like not everyone is just inherently passionate about recycling. Like it's so hard.
What?
Um, But I think it's like that's such a beautiful thing. And I'm like, not
Yeah.
everybody needs to be an environmental expert to take part in this movement, but we can say,
Hmm.
okay, you're really in nutrition. Maybe we can talk about, again, eating less meat or the benefits of regenerative organic agriculture.
Mm.
Or someone's really into fashion. Okay, they don't necessarily care about the carbon in the atmosphere, not because they're a bad person, but let's talk about fair trade and B corporation and,
Yeah.
supply chains. And I think that future really looks like meeting people where they're at and kind of adding
Mhm.
to what they're already doing instead of taking something away,
Mm.
and really making people feel empowered to know that they belong. And that's something that I've
Mhm.
seen. We just did a survey on our Earth Sessions climate concerts, and about 48% of people, so almost 50%, it was their first environmental justice event. And then all of them
Wow.
said they would go to another one. And it was really cool to see,
Oh,
like,
wow.
hey, we can coalition build with not just, preaching to the choir of just
Yeah.
changing what the experience might look like. So that's what I think that future looks like, one that's really
Hmm.
welcoming. People can kind of come as they are, and then you can find your own unique role within the movement.
Wow, I love that. That's very inspiring. And then, since a lot of our audience is working in corporations and running corporations, I'd love to kind of talk about the role of corporations in that narrative of that path forward of bringing people together. Where do you see kind of businesses fitting in that, path towards progress?
Corporations honestly can play one of the biggest roles in the climate movement, in my opinion. I know that can be frustrating for some activists, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, why does it have to be here? But I think the most important thing is wealth redistribution and also
Mm.
amplification. So when it
Mhm.
comes to moving through like bureaucracy, it can be really difficult for small nonprofits to apply for
Yeah.
federal grants. It can be really competitive. And there are organizations that even if they just donate 1% for the planet or more, could completely transform small grassroots organizations to be able to capacity build.
Yeah.
So I would say corporations, if they're able to, should become kind of allies and partners to the
Yeah.
movement that are happening around their headquarters, or like kind of really getting acquainted with what's going on, outside of their offices, and finding ways to support, because even inviting them to speak at their office for
Yeah.
employees to get more involved. And then again, the number one thing, and I hate to tie it back to capitalism, but if corporations, one of their main goals is to make money, then to redistribute some of that funding to good causes is kind of the best
Mm.
corporations can do, because they
Yeah.
can do much faster and with less bureaucracy than even our government can. So they can play an
Absolutely.
incredible role.
Yeah, absolutely. And have you seen, some really good examples of wealth distribution happening within corporations, or kind of what are some tangible examples that if a business wants to do this but just doesn't understand how, or maybe they don't understand how they could explain that to their investors of why they want to do something like this, how would you kind of advise them to go forward?
Yeah, I think Patagonia, of course, is a great case study, but it's
Mhm.
kind of baked into the company culture. So for people who
Mm.
want to go the Patagonia route,
Mhm.
every employee, their donation can be matched when they're donating to a
Yeah.
specific cause. They participate in 1% for the planet and give away 1% of the money they make to environmental nonprofits. They just started a
Mhm.
foundation that's specific for environmental things. So I think that's really cool. And then another example that again sometimes raises eyebrows in the environmental world, but it's really strange to me how the people who are responsible for Amazon, which is not the most sustainable business in the world,
Yes.
have at the same time given away some
Oh, yeah.
of
20
the
billion.
most Yeah, like so much money to environmental organizations, whether it's through the family or the climate pledge or all these other avenues. And there's been like hundreds of millions of dollars that have gone to grassroots organizations, which again, it's kind of like, well, yeah, that makes sense. That is their responsibility if
Yeah.
they're doing these other things to donate. But it is a really good example. And it was hard for me when I was scrolling through the Bezos Earth Fund and I
Mhm.
was seeing these radical environmental justice organizations, the father of environmental justice, the head of like the Indian Collective, an amazing indigenous initiative, all getting some of the resources that they need. And I know some people might be judgmental of that. However, they really need to capacity build. And again, I think that just goes to show that every company does have a responsibility and can do what they can. And if Amazon can do it, I think every company can do it in their
Yeah.
own way.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you were to kind of maybe give advice to companies, I see a lot of times, companies seeing also whether it's social or environmental initiatives, they see them as kind of separate from their business model. Whereas you said, Amazon, they're having this large environmental impact, and yet they're also donating so much money. And they're seeing them as kind of these two separate things when a business can function in duality of both of them, and the business can do better by seeing the integration of both of these things. How would you maybe explain to businesses why that's important to integrate those two things as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would want to, hit them at their heartstrings and be like, this is important because the planet's
Right.
important. But if that doesn't work, there's an organization called Futerra that I adore, and they have a study, I believe it's called The Honest Generation. And just quite frankly, Gen Zers in particular and millennials, and it just is growing with Gen Z and probably the generations after that, they specifically want to support companies that stand for something.
Yeah.
So that do something when it comes to the environment, that do something when it comes to social justice. We're at a time like never before when there's global events happening. People are not just turning to politicians, they're turning to the companies that they love. Even if it's like a tech company that doesn't really talk about these things, it's kind of the new expectation. So I think that's an important thing for business leaders to understand, that the cultural climate is changing, where
Yeah.
corporations do have a lot of power to influence the public and to also support different movements and things like that. So even if it's not because that corporate leader is a, firm environmental supporter, I think it's also really good for business. And that's a presentation my former boss, Rick Ridgway, gave at Patagonia. Like, it's good for business and it's good for the planet. And just to
Yeah.
understand that, and recommend they look into like the triple bottom line, people,
Yes.
planet, because all those things can easily coincide, and usually it's good for business as well as being good for the planet in the long run.
Absolutely, absolutely. And kind of particularly talking about some of the workshops that happen, initiatives that happen in particularly very large organizations. Of course, we talked about there's conversations about DEI and investing in clean tech. Those are kind of the main topics of conversation at a lot of these networking events, workshops, things like that. But sometimes the topics can be pretty limited in reach, and are not very expansive. We talk about ESG, but it's not really every environmental, social, or governance issue that we're talking about. It's kind of a select range. And I'm wondering, kind of from you, expanding upon this definition, where would you like to see some of these kind of conferences, workshops, initiatives that corporations are working on? What kind of conversations would you like to be taking place at a lot of these events?
I would say getting people connected to their local grassroots environmental justice organizations. That's one of my main CTAs because, again, yes, we need the introduction to like what environmental justice is, what intersectional environmentalism is, what those intersections are. But I think we can lose a lot of people if we don't point them in a direction of, and here are the local people in your community, or here are the people in the world that are doing really cool things, and here's your pathway to support them. Whether that's following them on social media, watching their documentaries, supporting them monetarily, whatever it is, volunteering, etc. So I think that's a conversation that I'd like to happen, because I think a lot of people I think a lot of people are aware that, we're in a climate crisis, but they feel apathetic and like there's nothing that they can do. So I
Mhm,
think being able to do world building
mhm,
exercises is really important to get with people and say, okay, here's an environmental problem. But let's not spend time focusing on the problem. Let's spend an hour getting into groups and we're all going to world build and radically imagine how we can solve that problem. Then we're each
mhm,
going to get up and talk about what that future could look like. Like, even if it's funny, even if it's silly, I think
mhm,
that's a muscle that needs to be flexed, like actually allowing people the time and space to world build together and to kind of get out of
mhm.
that pit of despair and kind of to imagine a better world together.
Wow, I love that. I haven't heard that term world building before, so I really like that. Um, and there's one question that I ask almost everyone I interview. Over the course of the book and interviewing 60 sustainability executives, I've always asked them, is there one kind of company regarding social justice and sustainability that can be a really great role model to other companies that are looking to change, particularly on the topics of social justice? Is there one kind of great company that other companies can look up to and say, we want to be there in 10 years? And almost every single one of the interviewees that I've talked to has said no. There's no company that's doing well enough when it comes to social issues to really be a good role model to other companies. So I'd like to ask you the same question, see if you have a different take on it. And even if it's not, one particular company,
Mhm.
are there particular programs within corporations that you see that are just really inspiring, that are very innovative, really breaking out of the pack, and going towards a really good, positive direction?
Yeah, I think them answering that question that way is really honest, and I think can also help people like exhale that, like, no, there isn't some beacon of hope company that does everything correctly. But I would encourage people to look at all the companies that are, fair trade or a B corporation or 1% for the planet partners. Like,
Mhm.
that's something that makes me really excited when I look at, like, there's hundreds of 1% for the planet companies, some that are
Yeah.
really small, some that are really big. And even though a lot of them were, giving 1% for the planet and could look the other way, during 2020, a lot of them decided to shift their donations a little bit to make sure that
Mm.
they were also going towards environmental justice organizations. So I know that's not naming any companies in particular, but I think those different networks and pockets of
Mm.
companies that are trying to coalition build together, not really sure exactly what to do, but are committing to something, that gives me a lot of hope. And I hesitate to say my favorite companies, all change. But yeah, I'll recommend people look at Futerra again.
Okay.
I'm biased because I've also consulted with them, but I think they're so amazing. They're a sustainability kind of marketing and research agency. And
Mm.
they realized that they needed more of an intersectional perspective, and
Mm.
just brought in additional consultants and decided
Yeah.
to redistribute the wealth to make sure they could bring in diverse consultants to like help their work, etc. So
Mm.
that didn't answer your question, but
It
those
did,
are
it did. I love that. And I know you kind of mentioned those few companies right now. What are some other resources that corporations can use for starting out, going down this path from, consulting agencies, books? Obviously, they should read your book, The Intersectional Environmentalist. But what are some other resources that they can educate themselves kind of before taking part on some of these initiatives? And try to think and brainstorm about how this is going to work in their company.
That's a good question. So there's a book, I think it's called The Climate Solutionist. That could
Hmm.
be wrong, but again, written by the founder of Futerra. And I think
Okay.
it's great because they've worked with so many companies from Clorox to perhaps Patagonia and beyond. So just like
Wow.
the range of companies they've worked with specifically on sustainability and their case studies on their website. Honestly, no one
Mm.
is doing it like them. So I would recommend
Huh.
people check them out. Um, Other than that, what else should people check out? Patagonia also has a really lovely library of books. There's one that's called Tools for Grassroots Activists, I think is really good.
Oh, very cool.
And they've got some good stuff over there.
Very nice. Wonderful. Um, Well, I know that, on an individual level, you often talk about, not as an employee, but on a personal level, supporting local businesses, going to farmers markets, really just kind of being grassroots, like you talk about. On that kind of individual level, how can people be an intersectional environmentalist on a day-to-day basis? What does that look like?
Hmm. I would say the first thing again is like coming from that place of empathy and doing some self-assessment. I think really getting to know yourself is just really fun too. Like, what are parts of your upbringing that might influence how you see the world, whether it's
Mm,
religion, your parents, whatever you read, are you an
yeah.
only child? So I think doing that self-reflection and understanding why you are the way that you are helps
Mm,
you just relate to other people who might feel really different from you, but just knowing
mhm.
like, oh, we're all such dynamic human beings, and that's such a beautiful thing. So I
Yeah.
think that's the first step in being an intersectional environmentalist, self-discovery, because it allows you to broaden your horizons about what other people's experiences might be like.
Mhm.
Um, and then I think, yeah, having that empathy and transforming it into compassion.
Mm,
And for me, again, when I went to rural Kansas and was a park ranger for a summer, I met people that were really conservative and were farmers who were not organic farmers. And I
mhm.
went in like, oh my God, how could anyone use pesticides? When I talked to them, they're like, we're just trying to feed our families. We don't know
Yeah.
what's going on. Like, we're just trying to figure
Yeah.
this out and keep our kids around and all that. And then being able to say, like, whoa, okay, these people are not the enemy. They need resources and support and feel like they've been left
Mhm.
behind, etc. So I think getting really curious about other people and then getting curious about what their experience might be. So again, Google your city and then environmental justice organization. And I think a lot of people will be blown away. Like, oh my God, I can't believe 10 minutes from me, there's a landfill that people have been trying to
Mm.
figure out how to not make so stinky for like 20 years or like
Yeah.
whatever it be, and just get really curious.
Absolutely. And I love that you mentioned that even having those conversations about sustainability with people who maybe don't have any sustainability knowledge or background, or maybe have been misinformed about sustainability to begin with. I know the Nature Conservancy, they publish a lot of work on trigger words and not
Mhm.
using those trigger words in conversations like that. Like you can still talk about environmental injustice without saying the word climate change, because climate change is a trigger word or something like that. Do you have any advice for how to have these conversations in a productive way when a lot of people have their own kind of preconceived ideology surrounding this beforehand?
Yeah, I think you can say the same thing in so many different ways. And I completely agree. Like, it's so important to meet people where they're at. And again, that's not dumbing down information because that's a really negative connotation. It's just like
Yeah.
meeting people where they're at and being an
Mm.
empathetic human. And
Yeah.
I think Dolly Parton is someone that I adore, that I'm sure most of the world adores. And she
Hmm.
has a quote, I think, about climate change. And she's like, well, God made this earth, so why would we destroy it? And
Yeah.
again, you know what? I'm not particularly religious, but if that helps activate the religious community to be an advocate for the planet,
Yeah.
then more power to her. Shout out to
Yeah.
Dolly. So yeah, I think that's really important to really meet people where they're at, find out what they're passionate about, and to make sure they feel like they belong and to not other them.
Mm.
And you can say the same thing in so many different ways. I'm not going to go off on a rant about climate change and how
Yeah.
methane, like where it comes from, how it goes up into the
Yeah.
sky, because people don't need to know all of that if they don't
Hmm.
want to, but they do
Hmm.
need to know that their water is not so great, or
Yeah.
ways that they can prevent that, or just everyday tips, etc. So I try to remember that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many great organizations that are working with churches and other religious institutions on sustainability initiatives too. I think there's a whole Pastors for Environmentalism movement as well. So yeah, absolutely. And then one of my last questions is, for people who might be listening to the podcast who are directly impacted by environmental injustice or social injustice directly, what are some resources and pieces of knowledge that they can utilize? You talk about education, music, spending time in nature if you have access to it, but what are some other resources and pieces of knowledge that you'd like to share to people who are directly impacted by these negative social problems?
Hmm. I would say it can be so hard. And sometimes, again, bureaucracy is really slow. So if there's an issue, sometimes it takes forever to raise enough awareness and get the change that you need, etc. But again, people power is so important, and trying your hardest to activate other people in your community. A lot of times it's not that people don't care about a particular issue, they just don't know. And like even growing up, like I said, I would drive over one particular highway, and my sister and I would hold our nose as a game because it smelled so bad. And it wasn't until later I learned that there was this like horrible toxic waste site and landfill
Wow.
right next to each other. So
Mhm.
knowledge is power. And when you find out those sorts of stories, even just having them in conversation, getting people kind of riled up and activated. That's
Mhm.
what happened in Flint. A community of people who seemingly didn't have enough power were really loud and were really vocal and got the country to pay attention. So I want people to know that just keep speaking up about the things that you care about. Know that change is slow. Utilize social media. I think that's one of the best things of these social media platforms, which can be terrible for so many things, but it's a great way to activate people if you're
Mhm.
not able to, be on mainstream news or other things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people find you on the internet? Where can they learn more from you?
You can head to my website. It's leahthomas.com. And I'm also on Instagram at Green Girl Leah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.